Welcome back to Between the Edits. My name is Grace, and today I have the joy of speaking with my good friend, Stephanie Selander. She is a marketing and communications specialist. She's done a lot of really interesting, varied roles in the space. She's taken coursework for a master's in fine arts and writing, so we've got some of that aspect, and then more of the kind of public relations, marketing, communications side. So I'll pass it over to Stephanie to introduce herself and tell you a little bit more about her experiences.
My name is Stephanie. I am a writer who was planning to be a teacher and somehow stumbled instead into a bunch of marketing, PR, communications sort of roles, which is where I am now. And I've been doing that for the past 7, 8 years or so. So it's just been an interesting ride, and I've written about a lot of things I would not have expected to, and most of it has been ghostwriting. So if you've never heard of me, that's very much why. hmm
Amazing. Okay. And so just to kind of put that out there, so you and I are friends in real life, right? So we met through mutual connections and everything like that. And we
hmm
just got to talking one day about books the way that book lovers do. So our friendship actually started more so because we both love the reading aspect. And then I come
Yeah.
to find out that you have like all these really cool experiences that I think are going to be really fun to talk about. So that kind of leads me into my first question that I have recently started asking that I'm kind of loving. So which came first for you, a love for reading or a love for writing?
Probably reading. And I want to say that because I was so young. I was a kid, and I remember my mom would take me and my sisters to the library, and we would get to pick as many picture books as we wanted. So, of course, I came back with these giant stacks, and I'd make my poor mother read them over and over. And I'm sure her voice got very dry. But that was just this big thing. It was a big deal to go to the library and get the books. And my parents were also readers. You know, my dad's really into history. I think that's also a thing for a lot of men at a certain age to just get really into a war and they just read a lot about it. And my mom is a big mystery fan. So, you know, Agatha Christie, things like that. And so they were always reading, and that made me curious. And I'd say, well, what are you doing? And they'd say they were reading, and I would be frustrated because I wouldn't understand anything in the book. hmm
So it really started sounding like very much like a familial influence, which I think I
Yeah.
hear pretty commonly of a couple other people have also shared that like their parents were like, okay, we want to get the kids into reading. So it's like sometimes it was a monetary incentive and sometimes it was just like anything you want, we'll buy. And then they realize, oh no, what have I done? They really took me on that.
Yeah, books get expensive fast.
Yeah,
hmm
definitely.
hmm
Okay, awesome. So started off with this love of reading. What were
hmm
you reading as a kid?
Oh, gosh. Anything I could get my hands on. My favorite book as a kid, I don't think anyone's ever heard of this book. It's called George's Store. And the whole concept of it was just this guy, George, inherits, I guess, his family store. And it just goes through all the different things. But the big thing that I was always excited for as a kid was there was a part where a lady that had a crush on George would go to the store and he was trying to figure out what she wanted. But then she goes, George, I want you. So I made my parents read that many, many times. I don't know how much literary value it has, but that was probably the first big one I remember.
Uh-huh.
But I read so many book series as a kid. I really did. But some books I kept. I actually have been recently going through old things. I loved a lot of old fairy tales being retold, especially for like YA. So everyone knows about Ella Enchanted. My favorite one, though, was Just Ella. And that one was fun because it was a Cinderella story told after the happily ever after, where she goes to the castle, but it's not what she expects. She's just this ordinary girl, but they're telling the story as if she's magical. And that one I really, really enjoyed. And I just kept reading from there. Then I got really into fantasy. I was reading all this high fantasy in middle school. It's about when I started writing. So everything I wrote was like that kind of thing. And then just branching out more and more in high school and then college. And now I just read all kinds of things. But
Yeah.
yeah, it was just nonstop, I think, from there.
Yeah.
hmm
So you started getting into writing around the middle school when you were reading a lot of those higher fantasies. Where
Yeah.
did the kind of natural desire to start writing come from?
Well, I guess if I'm to be honest, the first series I was writing was about a dog named Sparky and his adventures. And I was
Ah.
probably 10, but I was very dedicated and I had a very firm vision. I wrote at least like 5 books of that. And then around 12, I decided I was going to write a story which no one had ever written before, which is, about someone who's the last of their kind, and it's just very tragic for them, and it's hard being so different and special from everyone else. I'm sure this is a very new concept no one has ever done. Uh, and I had like this whole binder of that. But I think it becomes when you read enough or you consume enough stories, like movies, TV shows, you start to know what you like. And then you get frustrated when something isn't what you like, and you have enough knowledge built up to say, well, I could do that, and I would do it this way. And I think
Mhm.
that's how a lot of people start writing is they tell the stories they want to hear that other people aren't telling. And I think that's actually a great place to start too.
Yeah. I was actually telling this story just the other day. In college, I wrote a couple of articles for like the college newspaper. It was not a super big newspaper or anything like that, and I volunteered time and everything. But it was fun and I enjoyed the experiences. And one of the few stories that I wrote or articles that I wrote for it was about a girl on campus. And again, this was like probably like close to 10 years ago at this point, maybe like 7 or 8. And there was a girl on campus who self-published her own story, and her exact, that had that exact experience where she was reading these books and she kept going to her dad and saying, like, they wrote it this way, but really, I think the story should have ended this way. And then he's eventually like, okay, write your story. And so she did, and she self-published. And I think the reason why it made, well, we were a smaller campus and smaller newspaper, so story ideas were just whatever we could come up with, right? But I think why this one felt so interesting for me is because I could relate to her. But also, that was like one of the first experiences I've ever had with somebody who did self publishing. Because 10 years ago, it was certainly a thing, but it was not the machine that it is today,
Very
of
much so,
like
yeah.
everybody doing the self
Mhm.
publishing and everything. So, um, bit of a tangent, but that's what that kind of reminded me of is I think there are so many of us out there who just have that like inherent creative spark. And so you're reading something and you're like, oh, I love this world, but here's how I would have done it differently. And then that kind of branches into the whole like fan fiction sphere. Did you ever
Yeah.
get into
Oh,
any fan fiction?
did I ever? I wrote so much. It's embarrassing how much I wrote. I probably had like 50 stories on
Yeah.
fanfiction.net because Archive of Our Own didn't exist yet, so it was fanfiction.net. I will
Hmm.
not tell you what the account was, but I
No,
was
that's
very
fair.
passionate and it's funny. I learned a lot from that because you get instant feedback, which is good and bad, right? But
Hmm.
it's amazing. You're like 15, you've never gotten real feedback on anything, and suddenly you're getting it in seconds. And
Right.
I became a lot better at writing just from doing it. Something I heard later in life I like a lot is that your first million words don't count, which is
Mm.
fantastic because it was stuff like tragic lady in fantasy novel and Sparky the dog and then a lot of fan fiction. So but it teaches you a lot and it makes you also aware, hey, I have an audience reading this. It's not just me in my room listening to my favorite music, feeling very amazing at everything I'm doing. It's oh, someone has to read this and it has to make sense to them.
Right. And I
Hmm.
think it also, to a certain degree, offloads some of the pressure of having to create everything on your own. Another common piece of advice that I think we've discussed on previous episodes was somebody was saying that they really loved the fantasy genre. I believe this was season 1, episode 8 with Maddie Unruh. She said that she really loves the fantasy genre, but when she decided that she wanted to write her first novel, she chose to make it a contemporary novel so that she wouldn't have to worry about the mechanics of writing fantasy, where she could just focus on her characters, and that would be her first kind of experience into the art of story weaving and story crafting. And then as she kind of feels more comfortable with those elements, then she's like, I think in the future she very much wants to write some of
Hmm.
those harder topics to kind of really flesh out. um, because it is a skill, and that's something that I think you and I are going to get into about transferable skills between kind of the fiction writing world and then the marketing and communications world. So kind of just leaning us back towards that direction. How did you then transition into this love of writing? You take some classes about for a fine arts degree in writing, specializing in fiction. How do you get into that? And then how does that lead into how you ended up kind of doing some more of the marketing communication side of things?
Well, I think for me, around college, I was very fortunate to meet a lot of like minded people who wrote and were very passionate about writing and took it very seriously. And that was great because I could watch what they were doing and the paths they were taking. And I thought, I want to do this as well. I knew I wanted to teach writing. I didn't wind up ultimately doing this as my life path, but I did like teaching, and I like the idea of writing being something that you could help other people be better. I fully believe writing is something you can learn. It is a skill. Talent will help you, but it is a skill that can be learned and improved upon. And there's many, many kinds of writing. So I wanted to do a master's in fine arts. I wound up going to Florida International University. I was in Florida at the time, so that was in-state tuition, which is good. They also offered me some funding as well, and I really enjoyed the courses. The hard thing is you have to have a completed thesis at the end, and thesis of publishable work. In my case, as a fiction writer, it would have either been a novel or a short story collection. In my hubris, I decided on a novel. Novels are a lot of work, and my full admiration to anyone who has finished one because even a bad novel is so much work. And what wound up happening was the advice I got back in the day was, well, you could become a middle school teacher and then do that on the side. But when I ran that by my advisor, she said, oh, you don't want to do that. You will have no time to write if you are a middle school teacher. Absolutely, you should find some desk job and then just write in the evenings. I applied for a lot of those kinds of jobs. I applied for a lot of admin jobs. No one ever called me back. And someone suggested to me, well, you're a writer. Look for jobs with writing in them. This was maybe 2016, so the job market was very different than what it is today. And I looked for jobs that had writing in them. So I found a copywriter job, a social media job, a technical writing job. I just sent off my application. And what was interesting is they require writing portfolios, and often they'll give you an actual thing they want you to give them. So in the copywriter position, they had uh, a request for a come up with a campaign, have a press release for it, an ad. And I'd never done any of those things, but I thought, well, I can learn. That's the great thing
Mhm.
about being a reader is that you can learn. So I looked at things. I looked at a bunch of different templates that people did. I figured out what the general gist of it was, and I made my own campaign. I worked really hard on it. I sent it in, and I got an interview. And they
Mhm.
were very surprised when I was very upfront and said I'd never done a marketing job before.
Mhm.
So that was how I got my first copywriting job at a marketing agency. I don't know that you could do that today, but I was able to do that then, and that was how I got the foot in the door. And I will tell you, it was not a boring desk job. I was spending every day learning. I did not know it.
Mhm.
So every time I heard a word I didn't know, I wrote it down and I'd research it. I subscribed to a lot of different newsletters. I found
Mhm.
different places online for training and learning. And I had to spend every day not only doing work for clients, learning the clients, but also learning what it was I was expected to do when someone gave me an assignment. And I caught on much faster than I had any business doing. So that worked out surprisingly well, but I was very tired. And I would be
Mhm.
lying if I told you that it was a great creative period for me in my personal life.
Right.
Hmm.
So, would you say that you ended up thinking that that was a good fit for you at that time?
It was a necessary fit. I think, like a lot of people, we take jobs because we need to pay bills, and
Mhm.
I needed to pay bills. So I just took the first job that gave me a steady paycheck, and
Mhm.
then I wanted to be good at it. I have always wanted to put myself 200% into the things I do, sometimes to my own detriment. And I worked really hard at understanding it and asking questions. I think that's actually something that has really served me well in the different positions I've had is having the humility to know what you don't know. And
Mm.
I was fortunate in this way because everyone knew I was just the girl who used to teach, writing classes as a TA. I was like, "Oh yeah, you're the English girl who's coming here doing learning marketing." Okay, so people were very patient with me if I asked
Mhm.
something, but I also think they were patient because they understood I was going to go take their advice and learn on my own and iterate on it. I wasn't going to come to them for
Right.
every little thing. But it's
Right.
harder if you come in, I think, and you say, "Well, I am very good at this," and then everyone expects you to know everything. So I've internalized that it's good to admit what you don't know and to know who knows
Mhm.
the things you don't. I hope
Absolutely.
I hope it's not too circular.
No,
Yeah.
I no, it makes a lot of sense, and I think that
Yeah.
that also translates into writing, just
Yeah.
having that kind of genuine approach to what you're writing, and, correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're talking about, focusing on more of like the marketing communication specialist, you have to be very careful to only write what you know. And things like that. So having that kind of approach in general, I think helps with whether we're talking about marketing communications writing or if we're talking about fiction writing, um, being genuine about those things, I think translates a lot. Are there any other skills that you learned from that first kind of job where you're learning this whole new craft? Any skills from that that you carry with you to this day?
Be curious, because what I started with, it was very what we would call unsexy stuff. I was writing a lot of stuff for thermoplastics or machining, things that I had never really thought much about that are in our daily lives that have different applications that I'd never had to really delve into. And suddenly I'm having to write blogs or have to address, these very niche topics. And what is interesting is it doesn't matter what you're working on, there's always some kind of human connection. And I was working in business to business. So in marketing, business to business is when you are selling something from one business to another business. It's different than going to the store and buying like your own groceries and going home. That's B2C. But if you're trying to sell, I don't know, a fleet of vehicles to another
Mhm,
company. You're not really talking to one person. You're talking to a whole boardroom of people that have to make decisions on how much money they want to spend. And their goal is, can I trust you to solve our problem in a
mhm,
cost effective way and give us the quality that we need to do it well? So it's
mhm,
really about not just doing the job you're asked to do, but understanding what need you're fulfilling. And I
mhm,
noticed when I started looking for what is that human need and everything I was doing, it wasn't just that it got better, but it got easier because I was
mhm,
curious. I found where I, as a person, found interest in something. If you're talking about a highly precision machined uh, medical device and it's saving people's lives. That's fascinating. There are things that are life and death, and there are things that are just we trust to work every day. But someone had
mhm,
to do that work. They had to make sure the person they were working with, that vendor, was actually going to reliably give them what they needed. And a
mhm,
lot of young people that I worked with who had just come out of college and they were just in marketing, I think they were more interested in the flashier clients, but I
right.
personally found them less interesting because they took,
Why is that?
because a lot of it is, if you're doing business to consumer, it's often more an instant response you're looking for. It's more an
Mhm,
emotional reaction to something. If you're
mhm,
selling makeup or you're selling something like that, for example, I guess there's more of that aesthetic component and things like that. And I liked that I was building trust. I guess something with me with business to business was I liked that these are people that were taking their purchase seriously and I was giving them the information they needed to do their job well. I think for me, I found a personal responsibility in that maybe I don't feel the same way if I'm trying to sell, something that's more of a luxury good.
mhm.
Yeah.
That's very interesting. Um, so one of the things that I have known about myself for a while that has informed decisions when I've looked at jobs and things like that is like I know that I'm not a salesperson,
Yeah.
especially if it's like face to face or over the phone, right? Writing is a little bit different. But one of the things I've always said is I was like, if I have information and I am faithfully relaying that information to somebody else and they use that to make an informed decision, I have no issue with that. I love providing people with information. But I'm not gonna be the person who's trying to be like, "Oh, but, if you buy now, you get, this too, and we're running this sale." Like, I draw the line there, like, that makes me very uncomfortable. I'm not the personality type for doing that. So that's kind of what I was reminded of when you were talking about, where it's if you're doing the business to consumer, you might be playing a little bit more into some of those things. You're talking about, like high emotional stuff. You're talking about sales, and all that kind of stuff, as far as like discounts and things like that, like financial impact and everything. And it's not to say that those aren't factors in business to business, it sounds like, but it's just a different approach to how you relay that information or
Yeah.
is that a fair characterization? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I think also additionally, it's not that those things aren't a factor. Certainly people want to save money. But if your
Mhm.
first thing out the door, let's say I worked for a bit also in cybersecurity for doing marketing. And I think if you come up to someone and the first thing you say is like, I will offer you something that's really, really cheap, your first thought is, well, how good can it be, you know? Like
Right.
you want to know why it's so cheap. That's your first thought is you're suspicious. Whereas if
Mhm.
you are buying like a candy bar, you're like, "Oh, awesome. I love getting this for cheap. Hooray." And you just do that. But yeah, it's relationship building. Business to business is a lot of that. It's I trust working with you. I know I'll get something reliable with you, and especially when it's service oriented and not product oriented, though that is also a factor
Mhm.
in that one.
And this also reminds me a little bit of taking it back to fiction a little bit more. One of the things we often say is when it comes to marketing your novel or whatever you are trying to promote people to read, is knowing your target audience. And so it's
Absolutely.
kind of the same what you're talking
Mhm.
about here with like relationship building is like the
Mhm.
relationship between you and your audience, and specifically your target audience is building that relationship, knowing what they want and what you want to provide.
Absolutely.
Um, so that kind of gets into one of the things that we discussed talking about is this idea of how the purpose for writing informs the creation
Yeah.
and vice versa in that relationship. So, what are your thoughts on that, both from a fiction perspective and how you see that relating to or being different from your work in communications and marketing?
Yeah, I do a lot more of the communication these days than the marketing, which I kind of enjoy because again, it goes back to the getting information across. And audience, I loved teaching this when I did composition and rhetoric classes. We would kind of break it down into three components. What's the purpose of what you're writing? Who is your audience? And what genre are you using to achieve that? And a lot of things that what I do now the audience is just essential to everything. The way you're going to say something, let's say to the public at large when you're putting out an announcement, it's going to be a little different than if you're pitching something to an individual editor in an email.
Mhm.
And there's also a lot of overlap, even across industries, and even across writing, I think, in a fiction sense and writing for work. I remember when I started pitching articles to magazines on behalf of clients that I would then later ghostwrite for them. It was a lot like the advice I had been given about how to pitch a short story to a literary magazine, which is, first read the publication and then
Mhm.
look through it and acknowledge in your little pitch, hey, really enjoyed this thing that you did here. Actually, if you're interested in that, we can contribute this. If that's of interest to you, reach us by this time. Da, da, da. Great.
Mhm.
And it's very simple, but it's personalized as opposed to sending out 50 identical submissions that just say, hello, insert name here. We would love to do this for you. It's all very a me sales approach when what people want is something a little more personalized. So it's also interesting because a lot of times I'm not writing in my own voice. I would say almost all the time I am not writing in my own voice. I am writing according to some sort of brand guidelines or standards that I'm being held to. And sometimes I'm quite literally writing as someone else. If I'm writing a guest article for a CEO, if I'm writing a speech for someone that is going to be spoken by them, I have to try to sound like them. And it also takes some ego out
Mhm.
because my goal is not to be impressive. My goal is not to be the really great writer that made the best thing ever. It's all right, what does this person need from me? How do I give that to them? How do I accomplish
Mhm.
their need? And I find that also helps you focus on what matters. You know how in fiction it's, kill your darlings, and you think, oh, but I
Yep.
really liked that sentence. I don't really feel that way most of the time at my job. If someone just says, hey, we'd really like you to cut that out, I just go, okay, because again, the audience isn't usually me. So that's
Right.
quite fine. Hmm.
Yeah. I actually love that a lot. And talking about you saying that a lot of times you're not writing in your own voice. Just by the
Hmm.
virtue of the work that you're doing, you're writing either for somebody else or for a brand, which is even further removed from a specific individual. But you also love fiction writing. The first thing I thought of was is like I think sometimes authors might feel like they need to take that approach when they're writing their characters because so often your characters take on a life of their own and they do things that surprise you. And so you're definitely writing it in your own voice as far as like it being you and your writing style on the page. But as far as when it comes to your characters, like there's a little bit of that there as well of I would love for this to happen and this is how I planned this scene to go out. But then as you write it, it takes on a life of its own. So there is also a little bit, I think, of some of that. Again, not quite in a way of you having to again take on a brand's voice or write for a specific person, but just that distinction between you writing versus the story becoming its own unique entity.
And it's good to be flexible. I think whatever
Hmm.
you're doing, it's good to be open to propose change and be curious about, say, why do you want that? And I will say there are times, especially when you're working on production teams and you're in a collaborative, creative setting. This is true, I think, in jobs, but it's also true when you start sharing your book with other people and their thoughts, and then you're in a workshop and it's very vulnerable. The first reaction to feedback could be like, oh, well, this is a terrible idea. And I've had that too, even in work settings. When someone makes a suggestion, I think, oh, I know that's not going to work. But it helps to take a pause and just say, why do you think that? And sometimes people know something you don't, or they see something you don't. And I think there's something to be said for trusting the process. And yeah, sometimes characters can get away from us, but uh, I, I guess it kind of depends what draft you're on. I assume this is first draft, right? You're just getting all your ideas on the page.
Probably.
Your
Mhm.
first draft doesn't count. It is there to help you figure out what the story is. And that's frustrating when you're someone like me who wants to make every sentence perfect as I go, which is not helpful and probably why I didn't finish the thesis and I do not have my master's in fine arts. But it's something that you gotta just try it out. And then if it doesn't work, you can look at it with fresh eyes when you read it again. It's hard to know in the moment, is this what this character would do? Does it make sense? You probably don't know yet because you don't really know what the story is yet, even if you made a really great outline.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So you've mentioned it a couple times now, and I would love to just ask the question directly.
Okay.
Yeah, no. Just because you've taught classes for writing, and you've mentioned several times that you had to teach yourself a lot about when you got that first copywriting job,
Right.
and then the jobs after that, continually learning, continually being open, continually being curious. And then you have, like I mentioned earlier, you have experience teaching people, and you said previously as well that you firmly believe that writing is a skill, right? It's something
Yes,
that there is natural talent, of course, but anyone can learn to write and anyone can learn to improve their writing.
absolutely.
So, what have been some like key takeaways that have kind of helped form that position that I agree with, by the way? But what have you seen in your own experience and in teaching others that has kind of really shored that up for you?
Well, if you want to find out how people feel about writing, and this is pre ChatGPT, so I was pretty lucky. But I would start the class and I would say something kind of like, "How many of you are here and feel like you're writers?" And almost no one raises their hand. This is a required like 101 class everyone has to take in college. It is not thrilling. They're not happy to be here, and then I would say, "All right, well." How many of you get really embarrassed when your parents post something really awful, like on Facebook or social media? And everyone's like, oh, yeah, it's the worst. So I'd say, okay, well, what are things they do that are embarrassing? And they would explain it. And I'd say, all right, so what you're doing right now is you are explaining genre to me. You are saying your parents do not understand the social media genre and they're doing it badly and it's awful for all these reasons because you know what it's supposed to look like. You know what good is, right? I
Hmm.
said, you are a writer. You write things every day that are being received the way you want them to be received by other people. Social media is a form of writing is everywhere. It is,
Hmm.
and the more you realize that, the more you understand that every time you read something, you can also deconstruct it and you can take it apart and figure out why is it doing that. I remember, again, let's go back. I was writing my high fantasy novel that will never see the light of day when I was 12. I distinctly remember I got to a fighting scene and I thought, I don't know anything about fighting. How am I going to write this? So I
Hmm.
went to all these books I'd read that I really enjoyed. It was probably the Shannara series at the time. And I found the fight scenes and I would read them and I would make notes about the kind of things
Right.
they did. And it almost becomes a sort of dance, person does this and then this person has to react back and forth. And I had never really thought about it. But by reading how other people accomplished something, you figure out what tools are available to you to do the same thing. You just study
Hmm.
it, you deconstruct it, and then you can use those tools. That's what people mean when they say good writers steal. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
we lift it completely and ta-da, now I own the book. It means, hey, if this person did it, why not me?
Absolutely. Um, It's not only just, deconstructing it to learn how to be a better writer. Those are the same tools that you can in that process of wanting to become a better
Mm-hmm.
writer, those are the same tools that you use to critically think about anything, you know? And so as anytime that you're taking in information, whether it be the written word or something you've heard or something you've seen, you have the ability and the responsibility to break it down and try to understand it by critically thinking your way through whatever it is that you have just observed or like taken in. And so those are the same skills, and that's why we had this discussion kind of already, but
Yeah,
why we agreed that writing is something that really needs to be emphasized in schools, whether you're doing homeschooling, public schooling, private schooling, across the board. If you are a developing student with a growing mind, writing and reading is a critical aspect of that because it's how you operate in the world by breaking things down into manageable units for you to then process and think critically about in your brain and then decide how you get to use that information and act out in the world.
absolutely. Yeah,
Mhm.
and it's something too that it takes practice. You're never good
Mhm.
at it right out the gate. It's always going to start out bad and clumsy. And it's actually there's this great essay by Anne Lamott called "Shitty First Drafts." I don't know
Mm.
if you've read it, but I would always bring that into the classroom, and we would talk about the fact that actually anytime anyone writes anything, the first draft is not the final product. It is not good. It is just the start to getting there. And what I would do, and this was how I was trained to do it, this was the pedagogy I was instructed in, was we would do phases, we would do, first we'd talk, we'd do the introduction of how the essay was going to be. We'd then do peer editing. Once they were further along, I would take them in stages. I wouldn't have them do the whole thing right at once. And at the end, I would give them feedback. And if they wanted to, they could make those revisions that had been requested. And I would give them the better grade at the end of the semester because it wasn't about them getting it right the first time. It's that process of trying, putting together information, incorporating feedback, revising. Writing is a process, it is not a product. That's the
Mhm.
book, that's the essay, that's the final thing. But writing is a journey.
Right. If you would share a little bit, one of the things that is very particularly interesting for me, and I think a lot of people who will listen to the podcast. So I do developmental editing, but I also do my own writing in which I want other people to give me feedback. So it's a very interesting thing of how you accept feedback. But then once you're the person who's giving that editorial feedback. So you've also had experiences, it sounds like, where you're doing both, where you have received the feedback and you've also been the person who's instructing the students and giving them feedback. So I'd love to hear your experiences about those.
Yeah, I think it's you have to understand what the person's trying to do. When I was in my very first workshop, I was 14 and I was not good at this because I'd never done it before. And I got so excited. I wrote notes over everybody's stories about things they could do better. And then I one day walked around the hallway and heard people saying how mean I was because I didn't like anything, which was not what I intended. And I felt so bad. I've carried this memory with me all my life. And, but
No.
so with teaching, the goal is what is the student trying to do? And with when anytime you're trying to help someone in the book, and then don't tell them the story you think it should be. I actually once got into an argument with someone about this in a workshop. I was like, it doesn't matter that you might want to read the story from this character's point of view. That's quite fine. But right now, this person is trying to accomplish this thing. So what is helping them and what isn't? Point out what's good. Point out these are the things that are being done well. The things that are unclear, ask questions. Say, hey, I actually don't know what's happening in this scene. What do you want to be happening here? Like, what were you accomplishing? Pointing out too, like, hey, I think you're trying to make this character sympathetic, but actually, when you do this, I interpret them as, self-pitying. I think it's important to remember too, we're not perfect. Not all feedback is going to be taken into consideration in fiction, particularly with an essay. I am going to be grading the paper, so they actually do have to do everything I tell them. But if it's a workshop and I'm just a fellow peer, I
Right.
have to be mindful of I am only offering what I think I would do or what I would recommend based on what I assume they're trying to accomplish. But you have to also have the humility of, in the end, it's someone else's work and they're going to do what they're going to do. Again, that does not apply to academia, but but it's true in
Important caveat.
yeah in creative works where it's personal.
Mhm.
Hmm.
So another fun perspective that we can kind of take with this conversation, there's somebody out there who's working very similar roles to you. They're working in communications, or maybe they're more of the marketing PR thing, which you've done a little bit of as well. Um, Either of those categories, right? And they love writing and they also love reading and they're really passionate about fiction and they've always wanted to write their own stories or poetry or whatever it is, right? But they don't see the correlation between those two jobs. What is, in your experience, the very transferable skills between those two kind of avenues that might encourage somebody to trust themselves a little bit more with either route?
So to clarify, I'm following. So you're asking if someone's in a job like mine, how they could go into the creative side or vice versa?
Well, that way, or just what are some
Hmm.
of the skills that you use in your job, in
Okay.
your day-to-day job that would encourage somebody to be like, "I can take that and transfer it into writing my own story if I wanted to."
I'm trying to figure which approach is the best way to take this. I because the experience I usually have, to be
Mhm.
quite honest, a lot of my friends wound up going into adjuncting. That is a hard life. It does not pay very well. It is not. It doesn't come with benefits.
Mhm.
And a lot of times you're actually working at multiple schools. And if you're teaching writing, you're doing many essays at many different schools, and you're driving all over town, and it's exhausting, and you're
Yes.
not
Yeah.
paid great. So the advice I'm usually giving in this context is actually, hey, what can I do besides teaching? No one ever told me I could do anything other than teach with writing, because that's what they say. Why are you studying writing? Why are you doing this or that? And it's interesting because words are everywhere, language is everywhere, and a lot of work that I've done as well. I've done work where I am also dealing with like communications in, say, a crisis. How do you get that information out? How do you put it out there? Someone's got to do that. Someone has to make sure the information is accurate. They have to make
Mhm.
sure that it's coming to the right people at the right time, that you are organizing it in the way that the most important information is first going down. This is a roundabout way of saying if you really look around you, writing is everywhere. And I've known people who have transitioned to being technical writers. I've known people who've gone into marketing, and a lot of times because they've learned marketing through their own books. They have had to
Mm.
teach themselves that skill because sadly, publishing companies are no longer supporting people as much as they used to. They are a little more gutted financially. So people have to become their own influencers and their own social
Yes.
media managers and such. So they actually learn a lot of marketing skills just through their writing. But
Mhm.
and also teaching, I think, translates to a lot of things. And a lot of writers I know are also teachers. And if you are someone who's had a classroom, you've had to have project management skills, you've had to be organized, you've had to make things meet a deadline and deal with difficult uh, clients and things like that. You just have to be a little more flexible, I guess, with how you view yourself and what's possible. Though at the same time, there are resources you can do to learn things. There's, for example, a great series of public information officer courses that FEMA puts out that's available. That's really informative if you're ever interested in getting into more of the communication space. If you go and you want to learn about marketing, all the big marketing softwares, they often have blogs or they've got like courses you can take that will give you free certifications. Things like this exist. If you want to learn, you can. An area I would actually love to get more involved in is grant writing, which is another form of writing. I've just
Mm.
never done it, but you can learn it.
Right.
If you want
Mhm.
something badly enough or a skill badly enough, you can find it and you can learn it. And if you've already been writing creatively, you at least are doing a great job at communicating ideas and full sentences, and you know what grammar is, and you would be surprised how far that takes you. But if
Right.
you're, and let's flip it though, let's say you're someone and you're in a desk job, and it doesn't have to be my desk job, and you think, wow, I never got to do a writing program. I never met writers that are doing things successfully. I'm just sitting alone in my room. Why would anyone want to read what I have to say? And I guess why not is my answer. And what makes you any lesser than anyone else? If you have something you want to say, we are in an age where if you are 15 and you want to write a fan fiction and you want to put it on the internet, congratulations, you can. Like there is no gatekeeping anymore. So if you have something you want to say, why not? Why not you? The world is full of a bunch of people shooting their shots, so just shoot yours too. But it depends also what kind of writing you want to do. And I'd give like different advice based on those different people. But I'd start there. Believe in yourself as someone who is worth it.
Absolutely. Well, and
Yeah.
don't be afraid to be bad at something when you first start off. Like
Oh, yeah.
it's such a cliche. Everyone's said it, everyone's heard it. We all know it to be true internally, even though we don't feel it in the moment. But I have yet to meet a single person who loves writing and does hasn't also consequently fallen in love with the craft of writing.
Yeah.
And then that naturally leads to wanting to talk about it with other people and learning and being part of that process. And so if you just like find a locals writers group or find like an online forum or something like that, like there's no such thing as like there can be bad writing, but there's no such thing as like a bad writer almost kind of
Absolutely.
perspective in that like everybody's learning, everyone's growing, but like nobody is going to just automatically write you off because of one thing that you wrote. And like everybody wants to help you get better. Everyone loves to read the work. Everyone loves to give their feedback. Now, it can be something to say about getting too much feedback, right, from various
Yeah.
different people. You can get in a whole lot of trouble doing that too, but it's just to say that nobody is going to judge you for one bad writing example, and nobody is going to shun you from wanting to grow and learn in that perspective and help you along that path. Like I said, I have yet to meet a single person who loves writing and reading and has not fallen in love with the craft of writing and doesn't want to talk about it.
Yeah. It's funny too because it's so easy to bring things down. It's so easy to critique from the sidelines to just, sip your margarita and be like, oh, that's a bad book. Oh, that's bad at this. But it's hard to do
Mhm.
it. It's hard to make it
Yes.
happen. And I
Mhm.
think that also not all criticism is, I think the advice I got was something like, you're going to take about 20% of the workshop feedback you get when you're doing something in fiction. And that's about what you're going to use. Because some people
Mhm.
are just going to, they have no idea what you're trying to do. That's fine. But if you
Right.
just get overwhelmed, you just don't do anything.
Right. And kind of going what we were going back to what we were talking about earlier of like using those critical thinking skills and breaking it down into pieces. It's like you do the same thing with the critiques and the feedback that you get is like you accept it and you try to do that with an open mind. But then you think about the advice that you're getting from and you think, okay, who is it coming from? What perspective are they approaching my story with, right? How much of that is relevant to what I'm looking for? Like there's all kinds of questions you should ask yourself when you're getting feedback to determine how relevant is that feedback to you. And you cannot do any of that if you aren't at least first open to hearing it.
Yeah.
So just being open to that in the first place and then break it down and ask yourself logically and reasonably, does this apply to my story? Is this feedback that is relevant to what I'm looking for?
And also, another thing too is thinking of who you go to for what feedback. I think
Mm,
sometimes, especially with like significant others, it can be kind of tricky to go and be like, hey, could you read this? Because they don't know. Are you looking for critique? Are you looking for, you kind of have to work your way there. But if you have a writing group and you're all doing it and you're all being vulnerable, suddenly
mhm.
it's a little less scary. It's not like you're just putting yourself out there,
Right.
and you all feel a little more equal.
And then also being specific about like you said, like being specific about the feedback that you're looking for, because in that exact example, right? Like let's say both my dad and I love to write and we're like each other's biggest cheerleaders and I give him my stuff to read and he gives me his stuff to read. And one thing that we've done is we've had to be specific about, okay, I'm asking you to read this because I want you to look at my world building, right? So if I'm all excited and I'm giving him my sample work or what I'm giving him to read, and I'm really excited for him to give me feedback on my world building, but I don't tell him that. And then he comes back to me and he starts talking about the characters, or something like that. And then I'm like, okay, great. What about my world building? And then he's like, oh, yeah, I liked it. And now I'm crushed because he didn't immediately comment on the world building that I thought was so great.
It was
So
fine.
setting expectations can kind of help with
Yeah.
that too, because he's like, well, if I knew you wanted me to comment on the world building, I could have known that in advance, and then we wouldn't be having this conversation. Uh,
Yeah.
but expectations help with that a lot.
Yeah, I have I've known people who've done like a beta readers, for their
Hmm.
books, and they've like sometimes had like a questionnaire of like the specific things that they are hoping that you'll look for.
Yes.
That seems to go well for them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. We're going to take a quick break from the conversation so I can tell you a little bit about a great product. I want to tell you about the Tertulia for Authors website builder. As someone who made their own website when I first started freelance editing, I can tell you that it took hours of frustration to end up with a website that had half the functionality of the Tertulia for Authors website builder. This resource is specifically designed for authors, whether you're published or not. It's easily customizable, incredibly user-friendly, and puts vital marketing tools at the fingertips of authors, like blogs, event calendars, reader magnets, and email lists. And it's really affordable. So if you're an author looking to establish a website for the first time, or an author who already has a website but is looking to switch to a more manageable software, use the affiliate link in the description to sign up with Tortilla for Authors. Using this link does help support the podcast and is greatly appreciated. Now back to the podcast. Another thing that you had mentioned earlier, and I thought this was amazing. I loved it. So you were talking about you were teaching that class.
Yes.
to people, and you asked them, like, how many of you think that you are writers? And everyone said no, right? And then you walked them through that scenario where you're like, okay, your parents, they post embarrassing things on social media. Why is it embarrassing? And they're able to tell you exactly what they didn't like about the
Exactly.
way that it was crafted, right?
Mhm.
So that kind of made me think earlier when you were talking about figuring out what skills you have and what skills you need to develop. If you're
Yes.
not sure what skills you have, think about the media that you consume most frequently and start there, because you probably know that really, really well, and you can figure out why you know that media so well and what you know so well about it, and then fill in the pieces from there. I think that's another really cool takeaway that I got from our conversation of
Yeah.
start where you know, like everyone consumes some sort of media. Start there and
Yeah.
just see where you're at.
And sometimes too, it's funny, this is a little bit of a different angle on that, but, uh, taking things that you don't think about too often, but that you're constantly exposed to, same class, something I would do is we would, because it was rhetoric, it was, it's argument, how are things making arguments? And we would show commercials when we talked about visual rhetoric. And I would ask them, like, so, what's this trying to do? And it's like, oh, it's trying to sell you this. And it's like, well, how are they doing it? What are they trying to make you feel? And they had a lot of fun ripping it apart because they can tell people aren't dumb. They can tell the big swelling patriotic song. They just want you to drink this. Like, that's all it is. It's not really about being a patriot. It's please buy my product. And the
Right.
ways in which they're kind of being manipulated. You can empower people to realize they know more than they think they know.
Right.
Another aspect is when you read something, there was I wish I could probably look it up, but there was a passage that I would bring in that would highlight the length of different sentences. And as you read it aloud, you hear what it sounds like when you have a repetitive sentence structure over and over and over. But then you hear the musicality as they get longer and shorter and have variance, and you understand how language works. A lot of people, I think, are intimidated because they think they have to sound smart, particularly with
Mm.
essays. They think they have to sound like they know what they're talking about and they're going to look stupid. But really, um, what another exercise we would do for this is I'd say take something you know how to do, like make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and just write an instruction on how to do that,
Mhm.
and like make it maybe like the 5 paragraph structure or whatever, and then pretend that the person reading it has never done that before, and have someone else read it and be like, oh, you forgot to mention you have to unscrew the jar for the jelly or something, and
Right.
it teaches you, hey, this is really not too scary. It's just taking these building blocks and explaining how they all function together and communicating. In the end, writing is communication. You don't write something down without the intention of someone reading it. Even
Mhm.
people doing instruction manuals that you're never going to think you're going to read that are like this thick, they're doing the same thing.
Right. And
Yeah,
I think sometimes in that exact example you're talking about, you're showing somebody that they already have the skill set in order to create that instructional manual for
they
creating
do.
a PB&J sandwich. The genius of that example is that you're taking them away from a setting that is intimidating to them, of something that they feel is outside of their scope, and putting it back into something that's very manageable for them, like a PB&J sandwich. So writing an instruction manual for a PB&J sandwich is a very manageable setting. That seems very easy to somebody, but it shows them that they have the skill set for it. Then once they've been reinforced in having that skill set, they feel more prepared to tackle a setting that might have been previously more intimidating for them, whether that be, like writing an instruction manual for some sort of, piece of equipment, or if they're going into like something communications wise, right?
Yeah.
So showing that you have the skills, whether you think you have it or not, they may need to be refreshed. You may need to feel more confident in them, but removing it to a setting that is within the comfort zone then allows them to feel more reinforced before leaving that comfort zone.
Yeah, and there's patterns. Things that work in one structure work in another. I mean, like a very simple example when you understand how words function is, verbs do a lot of heavy lifting in a sentence. If you
Uh,
pick the right verb, you don't have to use a ton of adverbs and a ton of adjectives sometimes. Or if you pick the right noun, maybe more accurately, you don't necessarily need an adjective because they know
uh-huh,
exactly what you're talking about. If you are precise, if you know how to
mhm,
make the words do what you want.
mhm.
Mhm.
And I think that the more that people read, the more that they pick up on those things subconsciously, where you write a sentence and because it's your brain and you're putting it together, you may not realize it. But if somebody else were to write that sentence and then you were to read it, they would probably have an inherent sense that like something is off here. like a convention has been disrupted. But because it's your writing, you're so close to it that you can objectively see that. So that's why it's also so important to make sure that you're involving other people in that creative process. Again, using appropriate judgment about how much and from whom.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more you consume, the more you have that inner kind of library of information and resources. So like I
Mhm.
have friends who are technical writers who have joked that like, oh yeah, I'll, read the printer manual to see if there's any good tips in here because other people are doing it. Why not? See if there's
Right,
anything that might be worth stealing, right? Some good technique
right.
out there.
I liked the way they
Mhm.
did that. It made this more clear. I'm gonna use that next time.
Yeah.
That kind of approach. I
But I
love it.
used to, yeah, scripts were interesting too. I took a screenplay writing class and I was reading some, and there was one script I read. I want to say it was You've Got Mail. And in it, there were some sections that were like on, this character reacting. And that was how they described it. They left a lot of interpretation of to the actors to decide how to react. And I thought, I would have never thought to type that in the
Mhm.
screenplay. I would have thought, oh, you should say exactly what they're supposed to do here. No, I didn't even know that was a choice. So that's
Right.
cool. Hmm.
Well, and it kind of plays back into, again, that
Hmm.
we all have these shared human experiences of like, we kind of inherently understand body language and things like that. And that certain body languages are accompanied by certain phrases, and things that you don't have to always explicitly say things in writing in order for a general sense of an image or an action or movement or a feeling to be
Hmm.
conveyed. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. There's so much in there.
Yeah. There's a lot of really interesting things out there about writing. We could probably go on forever.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
so my last two questions, and these are probably my favorite. The
Okay.
first one is going to be, how has your work with communications and marketing and your experiences with creative writing, how have those changed your perspective on things in your personal life?
In my personal life. Oh, interesting. I think there's a lot of people out there that want to be understood. And I think that is often the purpose of having someone in a communications role is to make sure the right people understand the right information. And that can have pretty significant consequences if that doesn't happen in some situations. And sometimes, it's something the public needs to know. Sometimes it's something that a prospective client needs to know. But whatever it is, a lot of people know a lot of information, but they just don't know how to convey it in the way that the other person understands it. It's different things. And that also translates to just regular human interactions. Imagine you're having a conversation with someone where everything you say to them does not seem to affect what they say to you in response. That would be madly frustrating.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people do experience that, um, especially through writing. They'll send an email and they'll get something back and they go, that's not what I asked, actually. And it really goes on a deeper level than just writing documents or putting together just written words. It's also just, how do we engage with other people? Are we thinking about audience in our own day-to-day interactions? Are we so
Mhm.
busy thinking about what we're creating that we're not listening to what's going on around us and adapting appropriately? That's something I've noticed. And that's more, I think, the way in which something that is created inevitably changes when it is received by the person that you're giving it to.
Mhm.
Yeah. I hope that
That's
makes
a beautiful
sense.
answer. Yeah, it's a
Thank you.
beautiful answer. I loved it. Yeah.
Yeah.
As soon as you said it, I was like, "Oh, man." I felt the silence in the room. I was like, "You're got this." The gravity. I loved it.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. More lighthearted last question. Arguably, probably one of the most difficult questions. 2 to 3 book recommendations for our listeners. They can be any
Oh,
genre, they can be for any
okay.
purpose, just something
I've
that.
had to think about this.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I have a favorite book, which I can feel confident in general to people because I don't think it's got anything that I would feel embarrassed to say I love. So, because I also like horror books and I have to be picky about who I give those to. But I would say my favorite book is probably The Last Unicorn by Spiegel. Have you read this one?
No, but okay, I have a question for you.
Yes.
There was a movie that we watched every once in a while as a
Yes.
kid, I think it was The Last Unicorn. Is that based off of this book?
It is indeed based off the book, and
Okay.
the screenplay is by the writer. And actually, like you, I saw that movie when I was
Uh-huh.
a kid, and I was obsessed with it. I'm old, so we would get it at Blockbuster. And when it was my turn to pick,
Ah,
I would pick that
Blockbuster.
movie. And then 10 years later, my best friend in high school and I were like, oh my gosh, look at this DVD. That's crazy. And then I found out in college, wait, it's a book. It's actually very beautiful. It is a beautifully written book. I think every sentence is given so much care and attention, and it feels like a fairy tale for grown-ups. It is a story about what it means to be human, which is interesting because it's about a unicorn. But it's really lovely and it breaks a lot of expectations and stereotypes about the fantasy genre. You know, you've got like a beardless wizard, you've got a middle-aged woman with a bit of a temper, you've got this sort of lovesick prince who's determined he's going to be a hero, but it's a little bit, you know, he's not the main
Mhm.
character of the story. And it's a really lovely book. And every time I read it, I think I pick something up different in it and I relate to a different character depending on where I'm at in my life. So it's a good one to return to. And it makes me a better writer, I think, to study that one.
Yeah. How
Um,
often would you say you read it? Do you return to it?
gosh, in full, like probably not all the time, but I will reread passages that are meaningful
Mhm.
to me, like because especially just the emotion that I think is evoked in them and the imagery and a lot of the language choices he makes just feels so precise and unexpected and beautiful. I'm a big fan
Mm.
of beautiful prose. I know some people are like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't care, whatever. No, okay, I like these. Hemingway is fine, but this is I prefer this.
That's so amazing. Okay, well, I did not
Mhm.
know it was an actual I
It
didn't
is
know it
a
was based off
book.
of a book,
You should
and now
read
I feel
it.
like I have to read it.
It's
Yeah.
so good. I We'll have to discuss this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll put it on my TBR. I can't
please
promise
do.
you when I'll get to it, but I'll put
No
it on the
problem.
TBR.
Yeah, you will love it. It's great.
Amazing. So any other
Um,
recommendations you wanna add to that?
so I was trying to think, all right, what have I been reading in the past year? I've been reading a lot. So the books that I would say I mostly read horror.
Mhm.
I really like that genre. And books I've read that stayed with me are Tender is the Flesh. This book is it's set in like a cannibalistic society where people, due to a virus, or, you know, or at least that's what we're told in the book, due to a virus, so that we can't eat animals. So humans begin to become livestock. They like raise humans
Mm.
specifically to be eaten. And it is a very visceral book and it is a very disturbing book. And if you can't get through the first chapter, you can stop there. That's okay. Because the first
That's the
chapter
litmus
is
test.
yeah, it's a rough go. It doesn't spare you any details, and it's actually quite realistic when you think about how a lot of animals are treated. There's so many things I thought about while reading that book, and when I finished it, I I could not stop thinking about that book for a very long
Mm.
time. So that was probably
Which
one
is
of
a
my
sign of a
five.
very good book.
I think so. It's one of those ones that I think this one's probably going to stand the test of time a bit. I think, and so that was one of my 5 stars in the past year. But it is tough. So if that's not your speed, stay away. If cannibalism seems like that may not be your choice, don't read that one. But it is
Well, it's a
very
little
good.
funny because it's
Hmm.
not cannibalism per se, but I did have my zombie, phase where, I think I still have some of them. Actually, when I was in college, I took a writing course as well, and it was actually class for classical horror genre
Oh,
and, like,
nice.
thrillers, and, I am the opposite of you in which I don't read the horror genre,
I
and I think
love
it's
them.
because I know that I don't like horror movies, and so in my brain, I'm like, then horror books as well might be, like, not my cup
Really?
of tea, but I think they're different.
They are, and I'll say I am sometimes a baby about watching horror movies because 'cause I'm like, "Ah, blood, no," but I want to know what happens, whereas if somehow, even though books are a lot more upsetting, I can just sit there and read and then be disturbed, but it's because I guess I'm not actually seeing the blood and guts and
Right.
viscera. I'm like, "I'm okay, I'm fine,"
Yeah,
but I also go more psychological horror, to be honest, and
that's fair.
what I like about it, though, is every other book, there is a lot of conventions that are followed in storytelling where you expect certain things. And in horror, anything can happen if it
Mm,
is done right. And
right.
no one is safe. And I think it creates some really interesting and creative stories that could not be told in another genre. So I'm always really interested to see what people do with it.
Man.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I feel now that I must try both these books and that I
Okay.
must give the horror genre its fair shot. So, I don't know, maybe
Maybe
this,
don't start with Tender is
Tender
the
is the
Flesh.
Flesh.
You don't have
Yeah,
to
I was
start
gonna
on that
say
one. Maybe like a gentler one,
I was
but
gonna
it's
say maybe
good.
that one might be a bit much to start with, but if you have
Yeah.
a recommendation for, like, an easy
You
entry horror
know,
novel, I
if
might
you
take you up on
want
that one.
one, Shirley Jackson is phenomenal. Like, We Have Always Lived in the Castle. That's like Gothic. I really love Gothic literature as well. That would be a good one I would recommend. It's really short, but Shirley
Okay.
Jackson's quite good. And if you want to go shorter than that, The Lottery is a short story by her that's really good. Um, But I'd recommend that as a good entry because it's not so much that you're going to read something that's like very gore-ish, but it's going to be unsettling. It's going to be creepy,
Right.
and you'll get all the good horror stuff without the things that I would feel guilty for you jumping in with tenders of flesh.
Yeah. Eyes wide open and all that.
Mm.
Perfect. Alrighty. Well, this has been so fun. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for agreeing to be a guest.
Thank you
I
for having
really loved our
me.
conversation.
Mhm.
Like we were talking about before, I think for most of the guests that I've had up to this point, it's been very creative writing oriented and the mechanics of that, which I love. But I think you brought a really unique perspective today, which is kind of how, that translates into professional writing, which is also a huge category that's important to talk about. So I just really thank you so much for your willingness and time to bring that perspective to the show today.
Of course, and to everybody out there, writing is everywhere, and someone like me is writing those little words in places you don't even think about.
So be curious.
Yes, be curious.
Love it. Alrighty. Well, thank you so much.
All right, take care.